If you ask any reasonably informed person which aircraft literally saved the entire world from Nazism in 1940, the answer will almost always be exactly the same without hesitation. The Supermarine Spitfire. It is the absolute icon of heroic British resistance. With its geometrically perfect elliptical wings and the unmistakable, terrifying roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it became an immortal legend of aviation. The perfect fighter, the tireless defender of besieged London. But what if I told you now that during the most absolutely critical days of the Battle of Britain, this supposedly perfect aircraft had a humiliating defect? A mechanical failure so stupidly basic and dangerous that it could literally kill the pilot instantly if he performed a simple and common maneuver in aerial combat. Imagine the scene vividly. You are sitting in the cramped cockpit of a Spitfire roaring at 600 kilometers per hour. You are aggressively pursuing a German Messerschmitt fighter that just killed 2 of your squadron mates. You finally have him perfectly in the sights of your 20mm cannon. Your fingers squeeze the trigger. The German, absolutely desperate to survive, violently pushes his nose down and dives toward the gray sea to escape using negative gravity, the only tactic that works against you. You, instinctively trained, push your stick forward to follow him immediately without thinking. And at that exact critical moment, the powerful 1,000-horsepower Merlin engine dies pathetically. Not because of a successful enemy shot, not from lack of fuel in the tank, but because of basic physics gravity. The engine coughs pathetically, releases an embarrassing cloud of dense black smoke, and completely cuts power. While the German escapes laughing at his unexpected easy victory, you float pathetically in the sky, with a propeller spinning uselessly in neutral, instantly transformed into an easy target for any nearby enemy fighter observing. In this detailed video, you will discover the secret and rarely told story of the so-called G failure of the Spitfire. You will understand deeply why a fundamental part of the British engine was technologically inferior to available German technology, and how an absolutely brilliant motorcycle engineer solved the critical problem using a simple metal washer that cost literally less than 10 American cents. To truly understand the devastating size of the problem that the Royal Air Force desperately faced, we need to carefully go back to the hot summer of 1940. Proud France had fallen humiliatingly in just 6 pathetic weeks. All of Europe was under the absolute military control of triumphant Hitler. The only thing preventing the massive ground invasion of Great Britain was the narrow 35-kilometer English Channel and the Royal Air Force, the RAF, which was being systematically destroyed. The RAF had 2 main fighters in active service, the Hawker Hurricane, which was the reliable workhorse, robust and numerous, representing 70% of the force, and the Supermarine Spitfire, which was the technological spearhead, fast and extremely agile. The Spitfire was genuinely a marvel of modern aerodynamics. It was surprisingly fast, climbed like a vertical rocket, and made tighter turns than any other aircraft in European skies. In close turning combat, the famous classic dogfight turning, the Spitfire was absolutely undisputed king. If an inexperienced German pilot tried to turn competitively with a well-piloted Spitfire, he would inevitably lose and probably die. But brutal aerial warfare is not made only of beautiful and elegant curves. It is made of instant life or death, pure animal instinct, and decisive split-second reactions. And the experienced veteran pilots of the Luftwaffe, flying their lethal yellow Messerschmitt Bf-109s, soon discovered through bloody combat that the beautiful Spitfire had a deadly Achilles heel, a specific weak point that they could cynically exploit whenever they were in imminent danger of certain death. The critical problem was not in the elegant elliptical wings or the revolutionary aerodynamic fuselage. It was in the beating heart of the aircraft, the antiquated engine carburetor. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, despite being a masterpiece of engineering with 1,000 horsepower of raw power, used a technologically old fuel supply system, very similar to what you find in an old 1920s motorcycle or a classic Volkswagen Beetle. It used a simple float carburetor. It works technically like this. There is a small chamber with liquid gasoline and a cork float floating in it. As the engine demands fuel by burning, the float descends and automatically lets in more gasoline through a valve. It is extremely simple and works perfectly well as long as gravity is consistently pulling everything down normally. But in a combat fighter performing extreme violent maneuvers, gravity changes drastically all the time in all directions. When a pilot violently pushes the stick forward to dive abruptly pursuing an enemy, he creates what physicists call negative G-force. It is that horrible sinking feeling in your stomach that you feel when the roller coaster descends too fast. You float in the seat against the belt. Inside the Spitfire engine, the gasoline also floated dangerously upward. Under intense negative G-force, the gasoline inside the carburetor chamber rapidly rose to the chamber ceiling, away from the intake jets that feed the engine. Or worse still, it flooded the engine all at once like a wave. The result was immediate and absolutely terrifying for the pilot. The critical mixture of air and fuel became completely wrong. The engine choked pathetically like a coughing smoker. This lasted only a few critical seconds, but in aerial combat at 600 kilometers per hour, 2 seconds without an engine is an absolute mortal eternity. The aircraft rapidly lost speed, swayed dangerously, and released a shameful cloud of black smoke that betrayed its position to all nearby enemies. British pilots reported terrifying experiences in their debriefings. Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham described in his personal diary, "I pushed the stick to follow the fleeing Messerschmitt. The engine died instantly with a horrible sound. My stomach rose to my throat. I floated like a sitting duck target. The German escaped, probably laughing at my incompetence. I felt deep shame and uncontrollable anger." Another pilot, Sergeant James Lacey, reported, "I lost 3 kill opportunities in 1 week because of that damn carburetor. It is frustrating to have the enemy in your sights and not be able to pursue him because my own engine betrays me." The Germans know this and exploit it without mercy. While British pilots struggled frustrated against their own treacherous engines, the Germans laughed triumphantly at British technical incompetence. The feared enemy fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, had a technology that at the time was considered absolutely futuristic and expensive: direct fuel injection developed by Bosch. The German Daimler-Benz DB601 engine had no carburetor or primitive float. It had precision mechanical pumps that injected gasoline under controlled pressure directly into the cylinders. This meant that the German engine simply did not care about gravity or spatial orientation. It worked perfectly upside down, sideways, climbing vertically, or diving violently. It was technologically superior. The experienced Luftwaffe pilots learned quickly and shared the victorious tactic. If a dangerous Spitfire appeared in your rearview mirror hunting you, the German pilot did not try to turn because he knew the Spitfire was aerodynamically superior at that, and you would die. He simply violently pushed the stick forward and dived toward Earth with maximum possible negative G. The German engine roared and accelerated in the dive as if nothing was happening. The inexperienced British pilot, frustrated and furious, tried to follow instinctively. He pushed the stick forward, and the Merlin engine cut pathetically, with that horrible characteristic sound. The Spitfire pilot had to perform an absolutely ridiculous and time-consuming maneuver. First, roll the aircraft completely upside down to maintain positive gravity, and only then pull the stick to dive inverted. This complicated extra maneuver cost 2 or 3 precious seconds that meant life or death. In that critical time, the German had already completely escaped and disappeared into the clouds or flown back to safe France. The frustrated RAF pilots were absolutely furious with the unfair situation. They had the best aircraft aerodynamically in the world, but could not dive aggressively like their technologically superior enemies could. This is precisely where one of the most unlikely and absolutely fantastic heroines of the entire Second World War enters. Beatrice Tilly Shilling was not a glamorous fighter pilot photographed in magazines. She was an absolutely brilliant aeronautical engineer who worked at the prestigious Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. And she was definitely not an ordinary woman by the extremely conservative and deeply sexist standards of 1940. She competitively raced motorcycles on dangerous circuits against arrogant men. She was one of the first women in British history to ride a motorcycle at over 160 kilometers per hour at the legendary Brooklyn circuit. She understood engines, speed, and mechanics deeply better than any presumptuous man in the technical meeting room. When desperate complaints about the Merlin engine began constantly arriving from the bloody front, the highly qualified male engineers scratched their heads perplexed without a viable solution. Designing a completely new direct injection carburetor would take months or years of expensive development. They simply did not have that precious time. The Battle of Britain was happening violently now. Beatrice Shilling looked analytically at the technical problem and proposed a solution so absurdly simple that it seemed like a bad joke. She said calmly, "We do not need to expensively redesign the entire engine. We only need to prevent gasoline from flooding the carburetor during the dive." She took a small common brass washer, basically a thin metal coin, with a very specific calibrated hole drilled in the middle. The idea was to place this simple washer in the fuel line before the problematic carburetor. The hole was mathematically calculated to allow only the exact amount of gasoline that the engine needed at maximum combat power to pass through, not a drop more. If the pilot dived violently and the gasoline tried to flood the engine like a wave, the washer physically blocked the excess flow. The official part was formerly called the RAE restrictor. But the RAF pilots, with their characteristic acid humor and full of obscene double meanings, gave it another more memorable and amusing name. They affectionately called the life-saving part Miss Shilling's Orifice, a double entendre reference that made everyone laugh in the bars. Beatrice and her small dedicated team led an urgent national emergency mission. They traveled tirelessly from base to base, from airfield to airfield throughout the entire country, manually installing the small washer in the Merlin engines of Spitfires and Hurricanes. It was a mechanically quick and simple surgery. Disconnect the fuel hose, place the calibrated washer, reconnect firmly. 15 minutes per aircraft maximum. And did it really work? It was not an absolute perfect cure. The engine could still cut out if the pilot stayed upside down for a prolonged time. But for that quick and aggressive dive crucial to pursuing a fleeing German, it worked absolutely marvelously well beyond optimistic expectations. Suddenly, dramatically, the Spitfires could dive after Messerschmitts without coughing, without pathetically choking, and without embarrassingly dying, releasing smoke. The German tactical advantage evaporated completely overnight. A ridiculous little piece of metal invented by a motorcycle woman, underestimated by men, that cost literally pennies, returned lethality to Britain's most important fighter. Later in the war, in 1943, the Merlin engines finally received modern Bendix-Stromberg injection carburetors that definitively solved the problem. But it was Beatrice Shilling's brilliant workaround that desperately held the line when everything seemed lost in 1940 and 41 during the most critical moments. The Spitfire is an immortal legend of world aviation. But without the unknown Beatrice Shilling, it would be a legend that could not dive aggressively.